All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about CSS layout and responsive web design, otherwise known as RWD. Right, so you'll see this RWD in a lot of places, including our curriculum and our notes. Just know that RWD stands for responsive web design. So today we're going to be going over the different types of displays, the different types of position, z-index, float, overflow, and pseudo classes in regular CSS. After that, we're going to move on into the responsive portion of CSS, which is something like meta tags. Right, we've seen this meta tag being able to populate inside of our index HTML, but we have no idea what it does as of now. And we have this responsive units that we can utilize. So far, in our examples, we've utilized pixels. That's been done on purpose because we didn't want to utilize these units just yet. But now that we've gotten a little bit of practice with some front-end development, we can start using other units of measurement, such as percent, view height, view width, the view minimum, that's either view height or view width, whichever one's the smallest, and then EMs or REMs. And we'll go over each one of these and their differences and benefits. And then finally, we'll cover Flexbox in detail and why we would want to utilize Flexbox or where you can utilize Flexbox. And we'll cover media queries. None of these concepts is something that you'll be necessarily tested in here in Platoon, but they are concepts that you need to learn in order to create effective websites, right? Whenever you go in to create your projects or your portfolio projects, they could have a lot of functionality, but in reality, if your website doesn't look nice, no one's going to really like it, right? So it's important to be able to make your projects look nice and put a lot of emphasis inside of your front-end design. So does anyone have any questions over what you'll be taught today? All right. If there are no questions, then let's get straight to it. Well, let's go ahead and create a Vite project here that we can utilize. So I'm going to go ahead and utilize npm create Vite. It's going to ask me to name it something. I'm going to name it RWD for responsive web design. I'm going to choose React, and I'm going to choose JavaScript. So I'm going to change into RWD, run my install command to install any dependencies that I already have. It's taking a lot longer than I thought it would. All right, there you go. And now I can go ahead and run my development server. Now within this development server, I can now open my React application. We have all this front-loaded code that I'm not going to need nor utilize during this lecture, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. I'm going to go into app CSS, get rid of all of this information, enter index CSS, get rid of the following as well, and then go into app.jsx and get rid of these fragmented tags altogether. So now it's telling me, hey, this is broken. You're supposed to return something from a JSX component. So I'm just going to make some empty division tags here that I can access. All right. Now we have our project. It's completely emptied out. There's nothing in it. App CSS is completely empty. Index CSS is completely empty. And app.jsx just have one empty parent division. If we look at index HTML, the first thing we see here within our HTML tags in our header is we see these two meta tags. Now, I've explained this before, but let's see if we can maybe provide an example here. So maybe we can do something like h1, hello, Victor. All right, so now we can see the size is kind of relative to how big my screen is, right? It's able to adapt to my screen size. The way I see it inside of my monitor is different. Whereas if I were to place it inside of a smaller screen, the size that my hello Victor would be a little bit smaller. So now what happens if I take off this tag? Right? So it's a small change, and I'm not sure if you guys were able to see it, but this text just got a little smaller. And if I were to change it between screens, this text would remain exactly the same size. It wouldn't fix itself. It wouldn't change itself in accordance to the scale of my screen. So that's what this meta tag here is doing. This meta tag is grabbing the viewport, and the viewport is in reference to my entire monitor, right, or whatever it is that I'm using, the screen of my machine. And then it's saying, hey, we want to adjust the content of this site, specifically the width of the content of the site, to match in a 1-to-1 scale with the size of the monitor or the size of the viewport. So this is already making our site a little bit more reactive, and it's just a meta tag. Does anyone have any questions over this meta tag?
So is this why you change it if you want it to be like optimized for a cell phone or compared to?
Yeah, if you wanted this to be optimized for a specific form of viewport, maybe you work for a company that has only one device that people will be able to grab this application through, then maybe you want to change this initial scale to be only available or optimized for that one device, right? And then if anyone else who wants to use it, they would get kind of a weird version of it. It might look a little broken.
Okay.
Is that a question, Halsey?
Yep, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Okay, so let's start talking about divisions in this case. We're going to go ahead and go over to app.jsx. And in app.jsx is where we're going to put all of our content today. So there's some code. I wonder if I can do some sort of shortcut like this. Oh, nice. Okay, so I currently have a parental division that's holding 5 other divisions, I believe. Yes, it is holding 5 other divisions. And I actually need another 4. So I'm just going to go ahead and create that by multiplying div times 4. All right, and that's going to give me a total of 9 divisions. So now I'm just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, now we can see all of these divisions being placed. Maybe I'll give these all a class. Let me go ahead and do this the smart way here. Nope. We can give them all a class name of box so that we know each one of them is a box. And then we can give this one a class name, or actually this one will be unique. So instead it will be an ID of container. Okay, well, let's take a look at what's going on here. All right. We're going to go ahead and inspect our browser here. I can see I already have a couple of errors that I can get rid of. But specifically in our browser, what we want to take a look at is what's going on within the body. So now when I take a look at the body, we see that I have this division named root. That's okay. I know that's supposed to be there. But now when we flow over, we see container. And look at all the space that container is taking up for such a small amount of content. Well, I'm wondering why that's happening. And specifically, if I click on container, we see that this is a display block. Okay. So now I know that that's one of the different types of displays that affects a couple of different tags, right? This display block will be default for bodies, division, section, paragraph tags, header tags, and a couple of other ones. And then we'll start talking about inline tags here shortly. All right, so currently I'm in display block. And if I hover over the box of 1, we'll see that display block is utilizing my entire screen, right? When I hop over it, I see that it's a division box, and it's taking the entirety of an entire, like from left to right of my actual browser. And that's just one box, regardless of how much content I have, right? I can put a lower mixum in there to make it a little bit longer, but still, when I hover over it, it's able to occupy it from left to right. This makes more sense. I would expect that it's occupying from left to right because I have the content necessary to occupy from left to right. But when I have something as simple as just a number, then it gets kind of weird, right? It's why do you have to occupy all of this space if you only need the very left side to be able to render that item? Well, by giving an item or some sort of division the property of display block, I am telling it that it's essentially going to be a building block. Think of like Legos, right? You can't just put two Legos together because they're not actually going to connect. They're not working from left to right. You have to stack each block from top to bottom. And that's what's happening here. Each division is on display block, meaning that it needs a top and bottom, and it's utilizing that entire row of my site. Does anyone have any questions about display block?
Is display block is just the default? Is that right?
That's correct. Although I never explicitly gave it to it, if I go ahead and click on my browser, I click on my selector tool, and I click on any of these boxes, we can see that the division already comes with the property of display block. And that's actually the only style that comes built in to the division. Any other questions? Okay. Well, now let's talk about the other types of display, right? We're looking at display here in the block sense. But what if we wanted to change them to inline? Well, let's grab our container here. And let's also grab our boxes. So the first one I'm going to change is our container to inline. Well, when I change our container to inline, we see that nothing happens. If I click on my division for my ID of container, we can see the display property that comes default to division is now being scratched out. This is telling my browser that it's being overwritten and that now my container has an inline property, but nothing actually changed in the container, right? The container is still occupying that entire upper block. Well, what happens if we move this line of code down here? Well, now if I change my boxes to be inline, my boxes have now changed to where each division is functioning from left to right. And the only space that it's occupying is its maximum of top to bottom in accordance to the parent, right? So we see that here is the container. This is as big as my container gets, right? This is all the space that my container has to offer. Well, once we go into each individual box, the division still occupies the entire top to bottom of the container, but it no longer occupies the entire left to right of the container. Now it only occupies the space necessary to render the content that I need. And immediately after it renders the content that I need, it moves on to the next division. Right? There's no extra white space, nowhere. Everything's just working from left to right. Okay. Well, just like we did before, let's see what happens if we put something like Lauren. Well, now let's take a look at our elements. We still have our entire container. And when we move down to the lower division of box, we can see that it's highlighting almost everything. But notice that as soon as it moves to the number 2, it knows, hey, although this division of box is kind of overlapping everything, the remainder of these divisions still need to be attached to it immediately to the right. So as soon as we move on to box 2, we see that it falls to the right. It's still flushed, right? It's not cutting this off anywhere and then putting 2, 3, and 4. No, instead it's occupying that first division from left to right. And then upon finishing the content of that first division, it's immediately starting to render the next one, and so on. Does anyone have any questions about inline versus block. All right. So let's start talking about the happy medium in between them, right? So far we've gone over inline, where inline moves, attaches everything from left to right. And we've gone over block, where it occupies the entire width of the screen per each division. Well, what happens if we do something like inline block? And let's first take a look at it within our container. So now within our container, notice these divisions aren't all the same size or all the same width, right? If I scroll down to number 9, since it's the very last division and there's nothing else next to it, doesn't have that extra buffer space to the right of it. Well, lines 8 all the way up through 1, since they know they have a next division, they have some sort of, I don't want to call it padding, but they have some sort of external part kind of seeping out of it, right? But now if I place this display inline block inside of each box, well, now each box is inline, and it looks very similar to what we saw with inline. And let's take a look at what happens if we display that, if we change this number 1 for lowering it. Okay, so now here's where we can notice the difference, right? Before, it was able to render the entire division holding our lorem, and then immediately render numbers 2, 3, and 4 next to it, as if it were all one massive division. But now, because I'm using inline block, it's saying, hey, if this is too big and it occupies too much space, then instead of immediately rendering 2, 3, 4, and the remainder of the numbers right after, you're going to start a new line, and in that new line, you place everything in line. And that's why we see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 below it and not next to it, where if we do inline again, we'll see 2, 3, 4 move up, and inline block will separate it. That's kind of like the happy medium between the two. Does anyone have any questions about that? No questions. All right, so let's mess around with these boxes a little bit. Let's give these boxes a border. And let's give them 2 pixels, make it solid, and make it black. Well, probably want to give it a default height and width, so let's do that. Height, let's make it 50 pixels, and width, 50 pixels. And let's take off this lorem ipsum here. Okay, so now we have our boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we have these divisions. So now, what if I wanted to see something along these lines? I want to create these boxes, or I want my container to hold each box like this. How could I make something like this more or less? More of a grid rather than just a straight line, either up and down or left and right.
Is that where you change the display of the container?
Okay, awesome. So if I change the display of the container, what would you want me to change it to?
What about just
in-
display grid?
All right, let's try that out. That didn't seem to change anything. So maybe that's not the approach that we want there.
Would you just use inline?
Okay. So let's take it one step at a time, all right? Which one will put everything stacked for each individual row? So 1, 2, and 3, because we want 3 rows, right? What kind of display would take care of that from top to bottom? Would that be display block or would that be this inline?
Display block.
Okay, great. And we know that our division of container is already in a block. So maybe what we need to do is make a new class or a new division named row. Oh, did that all messed up? 7, 8, and 9. Okay. So now we can see these divisions happening. And we see that each row is only holding 3 boxes. So we've accomplished having 3 rows, one right on top of the other. Now, how do I make these boxes go from top to bottom, right? Because right now they're from top to bottom, but I actually want them to go from left to right. What CSS styling would I need to add into app CSS?
Use inline on each of the rows.
Nice. So I'm going to grab each row. I'm going to say display inline. Oh, did I not call them rows? I did call them rows. Interesting. Let's take a look at what we have here. So I click on the row, and the row is displaying inline, but it's not. Interesting.
I thought that the content within the row would need to be inline.
I concur. I'm wondering why it's not doing that.
Because each box has the display of block.
Could be it as well. There you go. Okay. So now we can see that the inline property got rid of our actual sizing that we had, right? We had 1, 2, and 3. Well, what happens if we add inline block? Now we get our sizing back and we can see everything happening from left to right. Now the question here comes is, well, why does inline or this display property here on line 9, why would that go on the individual box instead of the row? Why is that? Can you take a stab at it?
Can you ask that one more time?
Yeah, so if we move this display over to the row, right, nothing changes. Instead, well, it did change. Now we have 1, 2, 3, and 4, but that's because we put the block in there. Let me remove the block. All right, nothing changes. But if I move this inline display over to the box, then it actually creates a version of the grid that we want. And once we turn it into block, we get our styling back. So before we start talking about the block part, why is it that the inline needs to be in the box class instead of being within the row?
Does it have to do with like a parent-child relation?
Yeah, it's more like a parent and child, right? The display inline is saying, hey, do I have any brothers or sisters, or, do I have any adjacent children next to me? And if I have adjacent children next to me, then that means that I need to display myself in line or fix myself to give space to those children so that we can all fix. Whereas if I place it for a row, Well, then that's just saying, hey, I'm already in a display block, right? Because the container is a display block. And then it's saying, does this row have any other children? And it does. It has the other rows next to it, but those rows are fitting their content just fine. Each one of these blocks, right? Because the boxes right now are currently on display block, they're occupying the entire left to right portion. So that's why I can't do this display inline on the row. Instead, I need to move it over to the box. And then to get back my styling, all I need to do is give it the inline block property so that it knows it still has to follow the regular styling that I gave it of height and width. And it's not just fixing itself in line so that everything is jammed from left to right. Instead, it's from left to right as long as it fits with the parameters that I gave it. Does anyone have any questions over display block, display inline, or display inline block?
I just had a question on the box. So my understanding is that each row is treated as a box. Would that be a correct understanding?
Each row is a division block, yes, and it's being treated as a box. So here's a row, and that row is holding the entire left to right portion, and it's being stacked on top from one another.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Let's move back over to app.jsx. Let's get rid of these rows here. And let's bring in one extra one here. All right, so now we have our 10 boxes. Currently, we're all displaying them in inline block. Well, what happens if I do something like this? Where is my container? Let me see. Let's say my container will have a width of 500 pixels, right? And let's give it a border. It's going to be, oh, we don't want it to be solid. We want 2 pixels, maybe red. And then I think it's line through. Maybe it's dashed. There you go. Okay. So now we see that this is 500 pixels, right? And we see that the width of my box is supposed to only be 50 pixels. Well, if the width of my box is only 50 pixels and I have 10 boxes, why wouldn't it fit within a container of 500 pixels?
Is the border.
Okay, could be because of the border. So let's go ahead and adjust that accordingly, right? Let's say that the width here, instead of being 50, let's make it 46, right? Because we have 2 on each side. And now as soon as we make it into 46, we see that it can fit within my 500 pixels.
There's also a nice little tool next to the styles computed. I think it's the computed tab.
Talking about this?
No. Yeah, right there, that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we could see that the border is occupying 2 and 2, which is 4. And then we see that it's 46, right? And it's telling us that the width of the content or the center is 46 by 50. 50 is the height, 46 is the left to right, but then we add 2 from the left side, making it 48, and we add 2 from the right side, making it the even 50 that we needed. And now we're able to fit all of our boxes from left to right with an inline block. That's a common issue that a lot of people run into. So I just want to make sure that we that we cover that so that later on, if anyone's messing with some sort of sizing, they understand sometimes you just need to come down here and check the margins. I think one of the biggest common ones, if you look at the body, right, the body automatically comes with a margin of 8 pixels. So sometimes someone's trying to put something across their screen that's going all the way from left to right, but then their body, they don't account for the fact that the body has a margin of 8 pixels. So then they're struggling to understand why their content would stop short of the entire width of the screen. So to fix that, you could just do something like, well, I just don't want my body to have any margin. So you just say margin 0. And now you can see how my content has moved to the upper left-hand corner. If I look at my body, there is no margin. All right. Okay, so we've gone over a couple of box sizing things. We've gone over how to actually mess around with our different types of I'm so sorry, of display. Let's start talking a little bit about font size. Or I'm sorry, positioning here. We want to show a little bit of positioning, and let's go ahead and maybe use a different example here for how we can show positioning, because let's see. Okay, and let me go ahead and remove this container information here. Why are you acting like that? Let's see. I wonder what's causing that. Okay, that's not happening from container. Container is empty. All right, and if it's not happening from container, then it must be happening from within the box. Could be because it's breaking off into 2 lines. Let's take a look here. What happens if I just name it box? Okay, that fixes it. All right, so now we have our box. It's all working from left to right. But what about positioning, right? What if there's something that I want to do to this box to make it independent from everything else? Well, I can change its positioning and give it something like position static to tell it, hey, this is always where you're going to be. I can mess around with position relative. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. So let's give this box something like, let's go into our CSS. We're not going to need the row, and we don't need the container for now. Well, let's go ahead and access the box and open up its position element. What happens when I give it position static? When I give it position static, nothing really changes. Well, what if I give it bottom 0 at position static? Nothing's changing it, right? We can see that nothing's going away. And position static is just saying, hey, this is the regular application, or this is the default position in which any element will be rendered. Well, now what happens if I give it something like position absolute? Well, now if I give it something like position absolute, we can see that the number 1 has fallen within the box. Okay. And if I give it bottom 10, I need to give it pixels as well. Well, now we can see that it's exactly 10 pixels above from the bottom of my screen. And regardless of where I move my Chrome browser or my developer tools, that box stays 10 pixels away from the bottom of my screen. Now, why could this be useful? Where do you guys see something like this? Or whenever you're exploring some sort of web application? right? Something that's,
Footer.
yeah,
Oh.
right? Something like a footer or a header. Maybe there's something that you want to remain constant throughout the entire website. Well,
Logo.
say again?
Logo.
Yeah, a logo.
Or like a button that takes you back to the top.
All of the above, right? All of those things that we would want to remain constant to a website, we could always use them in the absolute path, and then they will always hover, right? Maybe this is supposed to be a button that when I click it, it takes me to the very top of the website. Okay, so now we talked about a little bit of this positioning, but what about position relative? Well, currently right now, if we look at app.jsx, the box belongs to a container. So if I move over to the container, which I just deleted, and I tell this container that it's position relative, it's not going to change anything in reference to the container, right? The container will still remain in the same spot. But what it will do is it will allow me, oh man, to actually reference it whenever I move my box. So now if I name this position absolute, let me make sure I'm giving you all the right one. Yep. So now if I name this position absolute and I say bottom 10 pixels. Oh, hello. Now, instead of seeing it moving from the bottom of my web browser, it is referencing to the relative container. So the container is where it's grabbing its relationship from, right? That's the parent. And then once I add that, if I have position absolute on the box and I tell it to move 10 pixels, we see that it's moving 10 pixels above from the actual relative container. Now notice that I'm saying bottom 10 pixels, that's moving it up 10 pixels, right? Saying from the bottom, I want you to display 10 pixels. So now if I make it top and I make it 50 pixels, that's going to drop it from the top 50 pixels below and render my box. And maybe we want something like 52 to account for the border. Okay, so position relative makes it so that when I use absolute now has an anchor point, right? So let's take a look at some TL draw here. So here I have a container. Let me place this to the top. And then I just have a regular box. So now if the box has position relative, or sorry, position absolute, that automatically tells it that it's referencing to the first relative division. Now, container currently doesn't have a position relative. So what it does is it references to the entire document. So now when I say bottom 10 pixels, what's going to happen to the box? Where's the box going to go?
It's gonna stick up 10 pixels.
The
Thick.
bottom of the page.
Okay, so it's going to the bottom of the page and it's only sticking up 10 pixels from the document because the document is the only relative part that it has to relate to, right? It's the first relative parent that it can find. So now if container now holds position relative, what would happen to the box if I give it bottom 50?
It'd go up 50 pixels from the bottom of the container.
Nice. So it would go to the bottom of the container and then go up 50 pixels. Right? And that's all because I added position relative to the container. So that the box, when it's in position absolute, it finds the first relative parent. In this case, it's container. And then it referenced the measurement to that.
Don't worry about your name.
All right, cool. Thank you.
And then if you could just fill out those highlighted sections, you
Okay.
can do that right here.
Let me see. There it is. I apologize, everyone. We had a hot mic. All right. Does anyone have any questions about position relative and position absolute?
I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
So does it depend on how big the parent container is when I make that the relative thing? Is that going to affect how it positions itself? Like if there's not enough space in the container, is it just going to do nothing then?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's take a look at it. So let's add a border. Let's make it dashed. And let's make it red so that we can see it. And let's make it 5 pixels. Okay. So there's our border, right? And it's relative. So our container is now relative. Notice how the box has no effect on the container because the box is now position absolute. If I take off these two properties, the box falls within the container, right? And let's say that I bring it back to where we had it. It would be too much work. Yeah, so right now it has nothing within it, right? I can add a couple of other boxes. Let's just go ahead and do that. So I add a couple of other boxes and we can see that now it falls down here and we can see 8, 9, and 10 falling to the bottom. Well, the container fixed itself. It says, okay, well, now we need more space because I'm fitting all of this information. Well, now, as soon as I turn this into position absolute, oh. And let me clean this up a little bit. So as soon as I turn this into position absolute, the container is still the same size, but that's because of 9 and 10 that fell to the bottom, right? Now, if I move, and let me make sure this isn't relative right now, okay? So now it's position absolute. The container is not position relative. So now when I move this box to the bottom, it's now independent, right? It doesn't belong to the container. It's saying, hey, I am absolute. I am not part of you anymore. I may relate to you, but I am still not part of you. So now let's say we do top 150. And that brings our box down here. And we bring back our position relative. Well, now it's going to say in relationship to the container, I am going to go down 150 pixels from the top. But even though it's in relationship to the container, it still knows that its position is absolute. So the container knows that it doesn't have to adjust itself to account for the position of the box, even though it's one of its children. Does that answer your question, Clarice?
Yes.
Awesome. Any other questions regarding this topic?
Can we do like negative numbers when you're doing like the top or bottom?
Yeah, you definitely can. But that would shoot it up. So I would have to change this to bottom. And then I could do negative. And top to, you're not limited to top or bottom. You can also do left or right, right? So we can do like left, make this 500 pixels. And that will push it left, right? So from the left border, it is 500 pixels to the right until it meets our box. Let me turn this into something like 75. Maybe that's a little closer up there.
Can you using the dev tools like hover over the box and just see its like borders and margins and stuff?
Yeah, of course. So let's hover over the box. So there's the box. It's completely independent from the division. We can see that it has its position 114 pixels away from the very top of the screen and 500 pixels away from the left side of the screen. Now, this 500 pixels away from the left side of the screen, where is that coming from?
Left 500.
Yeah, it's coming from here, right? This left 500. If I take it off, it's going to push it all the way to the left. If I bring it on, it says, all right, you want to go left 500. All right. Now this position on the top for 114, where's that coming from?
It's the -60 plus the height of the container.
Awesome. So it's saying -60. All right. So it's already 60 away from the top. And then after that, we look at the boxes. We see that our boxes have a height of 50. So there's two boxes here. So that's already 100. And then we have this 5 pixels, right? So 5 plus 5, that's 10, plus the 100, that's 110. And then the -60 is coming from the very top here. I guess we don't have to account for this part, but we do have to account for here. So it's coming from the top of our border. It's going down 100 pixels. We add 5 into it. So that's 105. And then this last portion, that's just something that that's because I haven't calculated this correctly. So let's see. If I wanted to make it even to where it's right outside, well, then it would be 50 and 50, that's 100, plus the border, which is 2, 4 and 4, that's 8, and 5, that's 13, right? Oh, did that all wrong. Yeah, I would have to figure, oh, it's because it's in reference to the bottom. That makes sense. Okay, so we can see that it's touching the very bottom of this division. It's coming down 50. But now if I account for the border, it brings me down 50. But then I also need to account for my border, which brings it down perfectly in line with the very bottom of the container. All right, so this top is coming from the 5, 2, that's 7, 50, 57, 2, 59, then another 2, that's 61, then 50, that's 111, and it's all getting added into 111 pixels from the very top. All right. Is that what you wanted to look at, Cody? Okay, perfect. Any other questions regarding this topic?
Yeah,
Andrew was- Sorry.
Yeah, I put a question in the chat. So relative is in relation to itself, while absolute is in relation to the parent. Is that accurate?
Absolute is in relationship to the first relative parent, right? So I could have another parent division in here. Right, so I have another parent division in there. So now the box doesn't belong to the container. It belongs to this parent division that I just put in there. But notice that nothing changed. And that's because if the box, when it's position absolute, it looks for the first relative parent, and the first relative parent that it can find is relative. Right, so that's how container, the relationship between container, between absolute and relative works. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thanks.
Of course. Any other questions?
Yeah, you might be covering this in a minute, but can we use percentage to kind of make it more dynamic as that container grows?
We will go into the responsive units of measurements in the second portion of our lecture, but yes, we definitely can.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So now we've gone over position absolute. We've gone over a couple of things, but what about position fixed? All right. We've container, or when we went over absolute, that was in reference to the first relative container, right? Oh, where did you go now? Where's my box? Did the box disappear? Yeah.
Maybe it's far left, 500 pixels bigger than the.
Let me bring it back. Okay, so there's the box. All right, so now we can see the box. It's 50 pixels away from the left. It's negative 57, all that good stuff. Well, now the question comes in about the difference between position absolute and position fixed. So position absolute is in reference to the first relative parent. Position fixed, on the other hand, doesn't care about any parental relationship. Instead, it's just referencing directly to the document. All right. Position fixed says, okay, well, regardless of how many relative parents there are, this is where I will always be located. I will always be left of the document by 50 pixels. And then from the bottom up of the document by 57 pixels. And that's our position fixed. All right.
I have
So-
a question.
Go ahead.
How does fixed interact with like scrolling around the page?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's take a look at that. Position fixed. And instead of negative 50, we want it to be 50. Okay, so here's my box, right? And let's just give my body a height of, ooh, I don't know, maybe do something like 200 view height. Okay, well, we see that it created the scroll bar, right? Well, now as I start scrolling down, we can see that this box is maintained and it stays on the bottom left-hand corner, regardless of the relative path. Whereas if I turn this to position absolute, it's going to find the relative parent. Make this negative here. It's going to find the relative parent, which is container, and it's going to go down 50 and left 50. But when I scroll down, we can see that it stays with its parent. Whereas in fixed, tells it, hey, regardless of what's going on, this is in reference to the viewport. Oh, I need to turn this back to 50. So now however big the viewport of the document is, I want you to stay on the lower left-hand corner, 50 by 50. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yes, thank you.
All right. That's enough about positioning. We have a couple of various other things that we still need to go over. But we are almost at an hour, so let's try to go over our Z index. And then after Z index, we'll go ahead and take a break. So let me go ahead and grab this app.js, this information from straight from our curriculum here. We're going to create a division. I'm going to have to add some fragments here. And this division
will then be, ooh, and I think I could do something like this. There you go. We're just gonna give these different classes. So we're gonna give it a class name. The first one will be outer. Second one would be middle. And the third one will be inner. All right, and that's just representing where each one of them is falling. So we have an outer division, a middle, and an inner. Well, let's give them some CSS styling really quick, just so that we could see it. Let's say that outer is 400 by 400. So let's give it a height of 400 pixels, a width of 400 pixels. We also want to give it a background color so that we can see it. We'll make it black. And before we go into any positioning, or actually, yeah, let's make it position relative. Okay, so there's my background. Maybe black isn't the best color. Let's go with gray. All right. The next one's going to be our middle. Or let's make our middle. And we'll just cut it down by 100 pixels. So we'll make the height. And let's go 200 pixels. Let's make the width 200 pixels as well. And let's give it the background color of green. Okay, so there's our first box has 400 by 400. Our second box is 200 by 200. And let's make our inner 100 by 100. So we see 100 pixels. The width is also 100 pixels. And in this case, let's make the background color red. Okay, so now we have all of that information fixed. And they're all falling within one another. Well, what if I wanted to do something? Oh, maybe I want to give this a little bit of a padding on top here. Let me give it a margin top to separate all of our content here. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Where's our outer? There it is. Okay, so there's all of our content now separated. We can see each one of them, right? And we have this position relative at the parent division, and we can see each one of our boxes, each being separated. Well, now we're going to talk about something called z-index, right? What if I want a specific division to fall within another one, or I don't want to be able to see one in reference to another one? Well, let's take this middle child, and let's give it a z-index of 2. And let's take this inner child and give it a z-index of 1. Well, nothing happens just yet. What happens if I give this a position absolute? I may have to reattack this over the break. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll see this example being exhibited. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, so we're going to talk about z-index real quick. Well, currently, inside of my app.jsx, I have my outer, my middle, and my inner. But notice that each one of them is right next to each other, right? The middle and inner are next to each other rather than my inner being within middle, right? So these two are essentially both children of outer. Well, in app.css, I mean, yes, in app CSS, we're gonna go ahead and make outer a relative position, and then we're gonna give middle and inner both position relatives. And then we're gonna talk about Z index. So Z index is in reference to where an element falls on the page. Right, and what I mean by where the element falls on the page is I mean as far as all of us being able to see it. Well, currently, right now, and it may be useful if we do something like this. Maybe I want to do right, negative 25 pixels, and then top, negative 25 pixels. Oh, that's only 100. So maybe let's make this W5. That may be good. Okay. So now if we take a look at our developer tools, or if we take a look at our project here, we have these cards kind of falling on top of one another. All right, and one more time. There you go. Well, what if I wanted this green square to fall behind everything, right? We can see the effect of it building on top of each other, right? We have our first parental division, then we have our absolute division that falls into it. And the way it shows us is it shows us this is absolute, right? Both of these are absolute, and they're essentially brothers of one another, or children of the parent. So they're both falling in the same position. And the reason why we see our red square of inner being on top of our green square is because it simply falls second in the children list rather than falling first. If I were to switch these, I would get the green showing up on top of the red. So now, how do I fix this or call this, but changing the order of these without actually having to interact with this with the HTML? Well, what I can do is interact with something called Z index. And Z index is defaulted to 1. So we could give both of them this Z index of 1, or sorry, it's defaulted to 0. And if we give them both the Z index 1, we can see that it all falls within the same page, right? Well, now what happens the moment that I turn the Z index of middle into 2? Well, now Z index of middle is greater than the Z index of inner. So it places our green square on top of the red square and the gray square. Well, now what if I wanted the green box to fall behind the red and gray square? Well, let's say we call it at 0. We can still see that middle at 0 is falling under the red square, and that's because the Z index of the red square is 1. But 0 is in line with our parent, right? The gray square is still 0, so the Z index of our child is still 0. Well, in order to fix that, I can do something like -1. And now when I turn it into negative, it also falls behind the gray square. And that's Z index. It's just essentially manipulating the order in which things fall whenever we're seeing it for the user. Does anyone have any questions regarding Z index? It's just def, exactly. All right, doesn't look like there are any other questions. So let's cover our last example before we go into our break here. So I'm just gonna make a div, and I'm gonna make this the ID of floating. And all we're going to do is we're going to add an image, but in this case, we're going to pretend that this is an image here. So I'm gonna have a div. This division, it's going to be an image. So I'm going to say class image. And then I'm going to add a p tag here. That's just going to hold some lorem ipsum. Okay, so now we see that I have a p tag with some lorem ipsum in there. Maybe I can put a little bit more. And that's all coming down here. And we have this division that we're going to pretend like it's an image. So maybe fake image. There you go. All right, so let's go into manipulating this object. I'm going to go into app.css. I'm going to access the fake image property here. Fake image. I'm going to give a height of, I don't know, 250 pixels and a width of 250 pixels. And then after that, I'm going to make its border black, solid, and with 2 pixels. Okay. Doesn't seem like we're able to see it. Did I spell this wrong? Class name, fake image. There it is. Okay, so there's our image. Everything's within the box. And we can see that everything is on display block, right? If I take a look at the inspect here, take a look at the console. Oh, sorry, take a look at my elements. I go into floating, I have this div, I have this paragraph tag. But in the parent concept, the parent is just holding everything in display block. Everything within this parent of floating is falling on top of one another. Well, what if I don't want something like that? All right, what if I want this image to just float left or float right? Well, let's take a look what that looks like. Let me go ahead and add the float property. I'm going to say, hey, you're going to float to the right. Well, now notice that it referenced the parent and it said, hey, if you have anything else, just put it to the left of me and I'll float myself over to the right-hand side. So now our image floated to the right and all of our text is on the left side, all still falling within the same division. So if I go back to inspect, take a look at this body, here's floating. That's the division that's in display block. If I open it up, we still have a image division, and then we have our paragraph division. But it is putting that image to the right of the paragraph because it is floating to the right of our division with the ID of floating. And same thing if I say, hey, I want you to float left. If I make it float left, it's just going to simply move to the left side of this text. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Yeah, can you just add like 1 or 2 more lorems just to see what it would do if there was like overflow text?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I just added a lot more text. And now we can see that once it overflows, it still floats the image to the left-hand side. And as soon as it clears the image, it starts writing on the bottom. Right? And if I close this up, we can see that it works along with it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Question. So if we wanted to give a little space between the box and the text, then on the right side of the box, would we add padding then to the box?
Well, padding is in reference to the inside.
Oh, sorry, that's right. Yeah.
So rather than padding, maybe we could do something like margin right? Maybe, who knows?
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Of course. Okay, well, now let's change a little bit of the properties within our text function. All right, let's go into our text block. Here's what we're referencing to as text block. It is our lorem. Well, what happens if I say my image is on the left-hand side? So if I say clear left, what will it do? Well, if I say clear left, it's saying, hey, you will not have anything to the left of this text. So even though I have that image floating left, the text block is saying, I understand you want to be to the left side of me, but I can't allow you to go there. You can't go to the left side of me. So what if I say clear right? Okay, so now, hey, the fake image is saying, I want to be on the left side of you. And the text block is saying, the only restriction that I have is that you can't be to the right of me. So if you want to be to the left, that's perfectly fine. But as soon as I change my float property to right, well, now they have a problem, right? The image is still floating to the right-hand side, but the text is saying, even though you move to the right side of the division, I can't have you on the right side. So I'm just going to move to the next block. And that's how the clear function works. Does anyone have any questions on that?
Well, I guess this goes with also the float. If there are more elements, more than just two, is it just going to go the rightmost or leftmost if we're floating? And I guess clear would just erase anything that's, or prevent anything on that side from being there.
So you're saying,
right?
You're saying that here, if I had multiple elements, like multiple p tags?
Yeah, if there was like another p tag, would it just choose to float all the way to the right?
Okay, so here's our second p tag, right? And we see that it's falling next to each other. So now, even though we have multiple elements, it's only addressing the very next one, right? So here's our fake image, and our float and clear functions are only referencing the first p tag, not the second. And that's always going to be by default. If I put it to the left, it only falls to the left of the first paragraph tag, not the second. So even if I made my first p tag have a lot less lorem, oh, we can see that it stretches out into the second. So I guess it falls on how many divisions or how much space it needs in order to be able to put itself on the left-hand side, right? But the moment that I tell it, hey, you can't be on my left side, well, then it's no longer an option for it to occupy both spaces because it has to make space for the first tag. Does that make sense, Clarice?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, the next thing we're going to be covering is going to be overflow. So how do we adapt to the overflow? Well, we have this container, we have this boxes that we can utilize. So let's go ahead and use that for example. Let me scroll to the top of the page here, our container. All right, well, if I gave our container something like a width and a height. So let's say my width is 300 pixels and my height is also 300 pixels. Well, now when this adapts, we can see that it's making a fall just like this. And maybe I want to do something a little bit smaller. Okay. All this other HTML is getting in the way. I'm going to comment everything else out so that we could just see the boxes. Okay, so there's our boxes, right? And we can see that we have a little bit of overflow, and this might be too small. So I apologize, everyone. I'm trying to find the happy medium here. And that's too big. Okay. All right, so here we have our boxes, and we can see that we have a little bit of an overflow, right? They're falling, they're almost pouring out. And let's see if I can make this. I will handle it this way for now. Well, now how could I handle the different types of overflow? In this example specifically, we can see that boxes 6 through 10 are flowing out of my actual container. Maybe that's not a behavior that I want. Let's make this a little bit more obvious. Let's turn the height to 150. So there we go. We see 6, 9, 10, and all of this other content pouring out of my container. Well, how do I handle it? Well, from the parent, I'm going to go ahead and give it the overflow property. What is it that I want you to do with overflow? Well, what if I just want you to hide it? If anything pours out of the container, just don't show it. Well, that's great. It's not being shown, but if it's content on the web page that I actually put on there, I would obviously want people to have access to it. And currently they don't. They can't. So maybe instead of hiding it, maybe this division is something that they can scroll through. So I can say, hey, I want you to be able to scroll through this division. Well, now I can scroll through this division from the very top to the very bottom. But notice that in order to make the scroll bar fit, it had to indent some of the lines that we had on the right-hand side. All right. Not only did it do that, but it also created the scroll bar at the bottom. There's no content to move to left to right, but it still created a scroll bar. So now maybe all I have to do is specify which way is it that I wanted to scroll. Well, now if I say scroll Y, now it's only going to scroll top to bottom, and there's no scroll bar at the bottom. And that's how we handle overflow. It's a pretty simple example. Does anyone have any questions over this? Okay, I'm sure at this point we've had enough of watching me just mess around with boxes and seeing some CSS, and we probably need some hands-on. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right, welcome back, everyone. We just finished our halfway exercise of understanding CSS to reinforce some of the information that we covered. I reorganized our project. I created a React component called Part 1 that is going to hold all of our code for the Part 1 of our lecture, as well as a Part 1 CSS. So both of these are applicable. You guys could you'll be able to see it during demos and notes. That way you could reference each part separately and you won't have too much noise. So let's go over Part 2 of our lecture. So in Part 2 of our lecture, what we're going to be covering specifically is going to be our responsive design. Now, the lecture starts off talking about meta tags. We already covered that over Part 1, but just to ensure that we all got that, can somebody explain to me what's going on here on line 6?
So it looks like it's taking the viewport, and as you adjust the size of the browser or the tab, or I guess window that you're working in, it scales.
Yeah, it scales with a 1-to-1 scale in reference to sizing. That's great. Thank you, appreciate it. There's a couple of other meta tags that we can add. We're not going to be covering them in detail, but know that they do exist, and you can definitely look them up and see what each one of them does when it comes to your index HTML. Now, the next thing that we're going to be covering today are going to be responsive units. So the easiest way of doing this is with a box example. Let's make more boxes. All right, seems like some CSS is already affecting us, and that's happening from in here. So let me take that off. Ooh. Interesting. I wonder where the CSS is coming from. Could be coming in from part 1. There you go. Okay. So now we have our CSS here. There's nothing on it, right? This is app CSS. That's just taking care of our box or of our background. I apologize. But now if we take a look at part 2 CSS, we can actually make a class for a box. On this box, maybe we could make it, let's give it a border. Let's make that border 5 pixels, make it solid, and we'll make it black. And let's say our height and width. Oh, well, height, let's make that 200 pixels. And let's make our width 200 pixels. And then I think I'm going to make a container as well, just to hold this box. So I'm going to make a div. It's going to hold a container. So I'm going to give that the ID of container. And I'm going to now access, oh, it's the wrong thing. A container and give the container, I don't know, the height of 500 pixels and the width of 500 pixels. Okay, and then just so that I could see it, I'm going to give it a border. It's going to be 5 pixels. It's going to be dashed, and I'm going to make it red. Okay, so this is what we've created so far, right? Now let's say that I wanted this specific thing here, or this this box to be centered on my container. Well, we know that I already have an inline and all that stuff. Maybe I can make this position relative, and I could center it. And actually, before we even start talking about that, let's go into the different sizes that we have here available. Now, notice that my container itself, right? I would probably want my container to cover my entire viewport. And it almost covers my entire height. But as I start closing my browser, once my container leaps out of what I can see in my viewport, I get this bar here for my X index to be able to scroll left and right. So now for this container, maybe I don't want to utilize something like pixels. Maybe I want something that's a little bit more flexible and that's able to react to whatever it is that I'm doing here. So what would happen if I give it 100% for height, and I gave it 100% for width? Well, now let's take a look here. Now, my container is utilizing 100% of the height and 100% of the width. Well, let's see what's happening. Right, because I'm still getting that scroll bar. Well, now we can see even though the size itself is 100%, I am not accounting for the border. So if I were to make this, I don't know, maybe 98%. Well, now I no longer have that scroll bar, and it looks like 99% might actually do the trick here. No, 98 is going to be a good one. Right, and we can see that it's going all the way across, not accounting for the border. So now let's say the border was only bottom, or maybe we could just do top and do something like this. Cool. Okay, so now there's no border to the left and right hand corner. And because there is no border to the left and right hand corner, I have this gap on my right hand side, right? We see how it stops short. Well, now when I turn this back to 100%, now it won't stop short. And I still don't get that left and right bar. right? Now I'm able to utilize 100% of my actual width. And I'm able to go all the way left, and that's still utilizing 100%. And I'm able to go all the way right, and that's still utilizing 100%. Now, here comes the next part, right? We have a division named container. Our container then gets imported into app.jsx, which falls in here. And this then gets imported into main, which then grabs index.html, and it renders it within a division named root. So now I'm wondering, what's going on here? Why is it that my height is not covering my entire project? Well, let's take a look. Here's my body. So my body, we know that it's way longer than what we want it to be, because specifically in app CSS, we made it 200 view height, which we'll cover view height here shortly. So my body is definitely the entire length. But what happens when I fall into the root? Well, root, the division named root, is not 100%. Right? So now notice that when I hover over the division of container, it covers 100% of the length of from left to right of root. And it also covers 100% of the height from top to bottom of root, right? And that's what I gave it in CSS. So if I look at part 2 CSS, I'm saying, hey, for height, you're going to cover 100%. So now if I wanted this height to truly be 100%, to truly go from the very top to the very bottom, what would I have to change in my CSS with my HTML to actually cover the entire page?
Would you need to make your root 100%?
Yeah, the problem is my root, right? Because the parent of container is root, but root is not covering the entire body. So let's go over to part 2 and let's access the ID of root and make it its height be 100%. Well, now we can see our border bottom is gone. And if I scroll all the way to the bottom, here's our border bottom. But that's still not very flexible, right? Because I'm getting a scroll bar and I shouldn't be getting a scroll bar. So let's take a look at what's going on here. If I go to app CSS, here I'm giving my height a view height argument. I am telling it you're going to be 200 worth of the view height. Well, view height kind of chops in percentages, right? So in reality, what I would want this to be is 100 of the view height. But it seems like it still scrolls, and it scrolls 5 pixels each way. Why is it? Why do I still have a scroll bar that scrolls 5 pixels each way?
Your border.
Yeah, I have a border that's 5 pixels on the top and a border that's 5 pixels on the bottom. So the moment I comment that out, now I no longer have a scroll bar, and my entire body takes in 100% of my view height. So here we go. So the body is 100%, and I know it's 100 because as I start going down, and maybe it's better if I click on the body. Here we can see the sizes, right? As I start going up, we see the view height getting closer. As I start squeezing this from left to right, we can see the padding, or sorry, not the padding, the actual content getting smaller. And the size of it is changing depending on what my viewport looks like. All right, same thing for container. If I click on container, it's a immediate reflection of what's going on the outside of its parent because it's utilizing 100% of its parent. So it's just essentially saying, hey, if my parent's utilizing this much space, I'm going to use it as well. So then finally we get to this box. What's going on with the box? The box is not reactive at all. What if I want the box to get smaller as my view height gets smaller, right? Maybe this is the size of the box of what I want it to look like when it's on a browser. But what if somebody goes to their phone and takes a look here? Well, now we're talking about different sizes and height. So here we have our height of 200 pixels. And let's say that we change this from 200 pixels to 20 view height. Well, now this is saying that if this was to divide the browser into 100 pieces, this would take 20 pieces from top to bottom, right? And we can see that as I open up my browser, nothing is changing. But the question then comes, what happens when I start closing my browser? Well, as I start closing my browser, it starts getting smaller, right? And I would want it to have the same reaction if I'm moving from left to right. Well, nothing's changing there because the height of my viewport isn't changing. So what if I change them both to view width? What would then happen? Well, as I make my width wider, we can see that the square gets bigger. But then I run into a similar problem. What happens when I start making my viewport smaller in reference to top to right? I mean, from top to bottom. We can see that nothing's changing. The square is staying the same. So what I'm getting from this is that if I utilize view width, whatever I'm making reactive is going to respond to the width of my viewport. And if I utilize view height, it's going to respond not to the width of my viewport, but to the height of my viewport. Well, neither of these units of measurements are actually meeting my standard or what it is that I need it to do, right? But I am learning that each one of them can be utilized for different purposes. Maybe I have something that I only need to be responsive to the height of my browser, or maybe I have some sort of frame that I only want to be responsive to the width of my browser. But now, when we're talking in reference to a box specifically, I would want this box to change depending on whichever one of the two is smallest or greatest. So what happens if I go to viewport minimum? Well, now at viewport minimum, we can see that if I move left, the browser, the square did change size, right? As I start squeezing it, we see the square still being the same. And notice, here's my, oh, where did you go? So here's my width, right? It's at 584. And here's my height. It's at 476. Well, let's see what happens as I start moving this down. Now it's at 547. It's at 500. So now it's at 496 in comparison to 476. Well, the moment that my view width starts to be smaller than my view height, we're going to see that the square starts to turn smaller. Right? And now the square itself, if I click on the square is 66 by 66 because it's reflecting 20 sections of the minimum height. And in this case, the minimum is referencing to my width because my width is 333. So that's the smallest size that it's going to reference to. Okay, well, what happens if I turn this, right? And I start making my viewport smaller. Well, there's 369, 342. Okay, so right now they're exactly the same, right? We can see I have nothing but threes in there, and our box is perfectly squared. Well, the moment my view height becomes the minimum, we can see that our square is also becoming smaller. Because as the view becomes smaller in the height, our square also becomes smaller in its dimensions. Now it's at 23.33 rather than 60, which is what it was at before. Does everyone understand those three? View height, view width, and view min? And does anyone have any questions over those things?
Is there something similar for like how what you did with but with the border?
With a border?
Like how your border is 5 pixels and it'll always be 5 pixels, and eventually it gets to the point where the square is so small the borders overlap.
Yeah, I could definitely also turn it into a view minimum, but I would want to use a smaller unit of measurement than 5, something like maybe 1 or 2. But even 2, that's a little too much. So maybe 1. And it would react the same way. As the square gets bigger, so will the border.
Is there a difference between doing like min height and then 20 VH and VM versus like just height and using vmin? Like, do they do the same thing? Is it just different ways, or is there a difference between the two?
No, there's an actual difference between the two. So let's say that we have 20 view height here, right? So we have view height and we have view height here as well. Well, obviously, as the height gets smaller, so will our square, right? The entire square is getting smaller. Well, now what if I turn this into vmin, but I leave my height? Well, as my square gets smaller, I guess this is a bad example, but as my square is getting smaller, it's analyzing that the minimum is my viewport, right? But if I make this really skinny, we can see that my height remained the same, but my width has now changed. And my width isn't the same as my height because currently the minimum, or what the smallest portion of my document, isn't the height, but instead it's the width. All right, so that's the difference. View height is always referencing to the entire height, while v minimum will run a comparison between the width and the height, and then whichever one is smallest, it will use that as its unit of measurement. So it'll say, hey, is the view height bigger than the view width? And if it is, then we'll use the view width. And if it isn't, then we'll use view height. Does that answer your question, Matt?
I think so, but I was more focused on like the CSS, like I guess it would be like the key for height. Isn't there like a min height key also that you can use to set a minimum height? And then if you use that instead to say 20 VH, is that doing the same thing essentially?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's just you would have to do it 2 times rather than just 1 time.
That's a good question. Yeah, so let's go ahead and do that, right? Let's say that our min height is I don't know, 20. Ooh, this is weird. 20 VH, right? Like saying, hey, this component can't get smaller than 20 view height. But then our height is 20 vmin. Well, now let's take a look. We can see that nothing changes so far, right? And notice that this two are the same unit of measurement. But once the width starts becoming the smallest part, the width changes, but my height doesn't. My height doesn't react because I set a limit here. I'm saying you can't get smaller than 20 VH. So regardless of what height is telling you to do, you will not be smaller than 20 VH. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions regarding the units of measurements? Okay, so even though we have vmin, what happens if we turn it into vmax? Does anybody want to take a guess?
It'll adjust depending on which is higher height or width.
Yeah, we're gonna run the same exact comparison. It's gonna say, hey, if the width is greater than the height, then we'll utilize width as our viewport unit of measurement. Otherwise, we'll utilize height. So right now my width is the greatest, and that's why it's able to change it. But the moment I make my height the greatest, then we can see the square start becoming bigger. All right, and there's vmin and vmax. Whenever you do or you go into developing a project, I recommend that you develop your project in the smallest frame possible. So you squeeze it and you make it look like this, or you could even choose like a dimension. Maybe you could use like an iPhone SE, right? And then you develop your project in the smallest screen possible. And as you start stretching out your screen, then you just fix your CSS to ensure that everything is still wherever it needs to be. All right. No, that's not what I wanted. Oh, here we go. Okay. So now we covered vmax, we covered vmin, view height, and view width. Now let's talk about text. So when it comes to text, oh, that's not what I wanted. What we're going to do is we're going to develop a small division tags. Well, we'll develop a couple of division tags. So we'll say that we have a division that has a p tag, that has a division. There you go. Oh, there you go. Okay, and let's just say that inside all these p tags, it just says something like, wow. Okay, so this should be showing up in our screen. Okay, there it is, down here. So we see wow showing up, and that's because of our container. Let me get rid of our container portion here. Okay, so we see wow showing up, right? Here it is, wow, wow, and wow. Great. Now, if I want to change the CSS, or I want to alter the text within the CSS, we can utilize something like the EM tags or the rem size. We'll take a look at what this means. So let's go ahead and grab the classes or add some classes into these division tags. Okay, so what do we want to do to the rem tag? Well, maybe we can just change the text specifically. Well, how can I do that? Let's say I want to change the font size, and I just make it to 20 or M. Well, at 20 RM or rem, we can see that they're all the same size, right? And maybe 10 is a little exaggerative. Maybe 1 will do the trick, or 2. There you go. So now we can see that at 2 rem, they are all the same size, right? Now, the moment I turn it from rem to EM, we can see that it starts doing this multiplicative thing. So it's going to say on the first division, we're going to have 2 rem. That's happening here. Then it falls into the second division. And because that same 2M is emphasized there, this is now showing at 4 EM. Then it has another 2. And this is now showing, I believe it's at 8 EM. So let's take a look at each one of those now. Right, so here's our rem tag, font size is 32 pixels. Here's our next one, it's at 64 pixels, so it doubled. And then here's our next one, which is at 128 pixels, which again, it doubled again. So it goes from 2 to 4 to 8. And that's the difference between the EM, which is emphasis. The more you wrap it, the more it's going to multiply. And then regulated, which means it will always just flatten out from 0 and then go up to 2. Does anyone have any questions regarding these two fonts? And they're responsive as well. So as the bigger it gets, the more the different the sizes will be.
I was gonna ask this, but like as I was asking it, I feel like it was silly because I kind of think I know the answer. But if you wanted to just decrease the size, you just use a negative number, I'm assuming then for EM.
Yeah, let's check it out.
All right, so then my question is, can you do that? Is that a thing?
Yeah, well, let's see. If we have it at EM, we can see it multiplying, right? But if we try to use anything like a negative number, it's going to flatten out. That's because when you utilize EM, it will not go anything lower than 1. You cannot use negative numbers in reference to EM. Does that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah. So I guess have you ever seen that done, or is that just something that's never really done? So like make it smaller by, I guess, how it's nested.
I think you could definitely create some custom class or some JavaScript that will do that for you. But there's nothing CSS oriented that will do that for you naturally.
All right, thanks.
Of course. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be flex, our favorite thing. More boxes. Let's go. Okay. So we currently have our container. We have this box. Let me comment the majority of this out here. And now let me just give this 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we have our 9 boxes. Right now they're at 20 vmax. I'm gonna go ahead and change this for 10 vmin. Just so I could have some smaller boxes to work with. Okay, so there we can see we have 10 vmin and we have our boxes. Well, now currently I have all my boxes falling from top to bottom. But if I wanted to change that, well, earlier we saw that I can give the children something like display inline. And that will make all the children fall from left to right without their properties. I could give it inline block, and it would make the children fall from left to right while keeping their sizes. So that's great. And I'm glad that that works for inline block. But what if I wanted to alter these properties from the parent component? Well, then I can tell the parent that it will display all of its children in flex, meaning from left to right. Now, there's one key difference that just happened. What's the difference between display flex and inline block when I rendered both of these methods?
I think that's how it looks.
Say again?
Is that the default? It displays in a row.
Yeah. But notice that when I use inline block, it kept the sizes, right? If I look at the sizes here, oh, well, that changes whenever I do that. But if I look at the sizes, we can see that the element, oh, how can I do this? Let's see. Maybe I just need to add a couple more boxes. we can see that the element for block 9, or all of these elements, are currently holding the same size, right? They're just reacting to the CSS styling that I gave it, as far as in height and width. But in contrary, if I use display flex will make them fit from left to right. And they do not keep the sizing. Instead, they're being adjusted to fit from left to right. All right, if I squeeze this, we can see they're still fitting from left to right. And they have no choice. All right, I could definitely stop this by doing something like min width. So if I do something like min width, and I tell it that the minimum width will be 10 vmin. Well, now when I go to squeeze this, I'm going to get an overflow, right? We can see that the height is getting smaller, but the width did not, because it kept its width. Right, so that's the difference between display flex. Display flex will make things fit, while inline block will not make things fit. And let me get rid of the extra boxes that I added in here. Okay. So I'm back to having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's great. So that's display flex. Well, what about display column? Oh, sorry, display flex, and then I can give it a direction. Currently, right now, it's in a row. I can reverse the row to have it go from 9 through 1 without changing anything specifically about it. Or I can also turn it into a column. And if I turn it into a column, we'll see that it essentially turns back into what it was before. But it also gives me the ability to say column reverse. And it's able to reverse the column. So now let's mess around with our container a little bit. Maybe our container is 80 and it has a height of 50%. And let's give it a border so that we can see what's going on here. Okay, so there's our border. We can see that it's falling in a column and it's supposed to be at 50%. But yet, whenever I open it up, as the blocks get bigger, so does my border, right? My container is getting bigger as well. How can I fix that? What if I want my container to stay at the height, at the maximum height of 50%?
50 VH.
Okay, let's utilize something like view height. Okay, and that's stopping it from growing, right? Now it's saying, all right, well, now you're going to stay at a view height of 50 VH. And let's say that it's going to stay at a width of 80 view width. Okay. So now my box is a little bit reactive, but not too much. We can see that it's growing, but notice that the elements inside are now being forced to squish, right? Well, now I wonder, what else can I do? What happens if I turn it back into flex? Well, it's squishing all of them still. That's great. But now let's talk about something called justify content. And I'm going to change these boxes to go from 10 to 5. Okay, so now we can see that we have a little bit of a gap here on the right-hand side. And let me comment out some of these boxes real quick. Okay, so now we see that we have a little bit of buffer on the right-hand side. I can take a look at my CSS one more time. Oh, my width was also supposed to be 5, so let me change that. right? Now I have quite a bit of buffer on the right-hand side. And I'm utilizing the display flex property. And my flex direction is in row. It's showing it from left to right, the default value. Well, what else does flex do for me? Well, flex also allows me to pass in an argument called justify content. And I can say, hey, I want you to center this content. And now we can see that the content of 1, 2, and 3 has now been centered. I can also tell justify content to put space between my boxes. And now we can see that it flushes the first and last element to each corner, but it leaves the middle element placed in the middle. Well, what happens if I have another part too, right? Well, now notice that the 2s have divided the space evenly in between them, but 1 and 3 is still pinned to each corner. So that's space between. Well, what other properties are available? What about space around? What does that do? Well, now none of them are pinned to a corner, and they all have space around them. And the space or the margin in between each box is exactly the same. Right? So from here to here is the same as halfway from here to here, and from this midpoint to box number 2, and so on. Well, that's space around. What about space evenly? Well, space evenly takes the entire thing, the entire width. It does a little bit of math under the hood, and it figures out where to place each one of them so that they're always evenly apart. Okay, so that's pretty good manipulation from left to right. But what if I wanted to adjust to my elements from top to bottom? Well, that's where the align items property comes into play. And that can make my items flex start, which is already where it's being placed. I can make them flex end. And since the entire container is what's being flexed, it places them at the bottom of my container. If I wanted to see them centered in my container, I can say align items center. And now my items are evenly spaced apart, but centered. And then comes the $1 million question. Well, how do you center a div? Well, if this is my container, if I wanted to see these boxes centered, I would display flex and then conduct justify content center, align item center. And that would center my entire division or any content that needs to be centered on my screen. Does anyone have any questions around display flex?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So for justify content, it's always left to right, or is that dependent on the flex direction?
Justify content will be left to right, but you could definitely reverse it on the flex direction. But by default, it will always be left to right. Does that answer your question, Clears?
Yes.
All right. Any other questions regarding flex? Okay. Then in that case, the last thing we're going to go over today is going to be media queries. So now, maybe once your screen gets to a specific width or a specific height, you want some sort of behavior to happen. Well, you can do that utilizing a media query. And then you can see the VS Code is already trying to give me a hint. It's like, hey, are you trying to do a screen media query? And yes, I do. But instead of utilizing the shortcut, I'm going to go ahead and type it out. So I'm going to say at media, at the max width of 500 pixels, I want you to make the background color I don't know, green. Oh, and that's actually wrong. So this opens up where this CSS should be triggered. But this takes in arguments like tags. So I want the body's background color to be green. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happening. I'm gonna take a look at the body. Currently, my body is 762 pixels. Well, now, as I start squishing my body, and you can see it on the upper right-hand corner as well, we can see that now I'm at 600. Currently at 636, 610. Okay, 603. Now I'm at 500. Right now, my width is at 501. The moment that my width turns into 400, anything at 500, so 500 or below, the background color of my entire body has now turned green. So it's saying once the condition or anything prior to this condition being met, you're going to conduct this CSS. But once it's greater than 500 pixels, so once it's outside of 500 pixels, utilize the default CSS that I provided above. Okay. Well, now, what if we make it the other direction? All right, what happens if we use min width? Well, now it turns into 500 pixels until it's less than. All right, so it turns green until it's less than 500 pixels. And everything within this body is just regular CSS. You can still call classes, IDs, just give it specific styling that you want to happen once this condition is met. And just like we could do min width, we could do something like view height. So let's do media. And let's say at max height. And let's make it 300 pixels. And I want the body background color to turn red. Okay, so currently it's green because it's above 500, right? Or is it below? No, it's below 500 right now because we're utilizing min. So what happens once I start squeezing this? Currently my height's at 500. Now it's at 4. Now it's at 350. And as soon as it turns above, so now it's currently 300 on the dot, so this condition is met, my background color turns red. Well, now let's experiment with this a little bit. If I make this bigger or wider than 500 pixels, my background color turns green. That's what I have here. Well, now if I make it smaller than 300 pixels, as far as in height, my background color turns red. How do I know which one of these media queries trumps the other?
It's whatever's
whichever
left.
one comes second?
Did you say that again, Megan?
It's the one that comes second.
Yeah, it's just looking at the order of the CSS. There's no specific indicator. It doesn't matter what the arguments are. It's just looking at the order of the CSS, right? If I were to flip these back and forth, well, then now my color would be green because this is what comes in second. And that's media queries. Does anyone have any questions about media queries?
Francisco, is the media queries, is this something like kind of like if you're dealing with like a cell phone screen, is that where this kind of comes into handy, or what's kind of the benefit of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, let's see. What application does this really well? Okay, so let's go to the Poke API. All right. So currently I have, and let's go look at their documentation. So currently my screen is pretty wide. So they're giving me this contents, and I could almost assume that this right here is just two divisions that are in display flex, and they're telling them to be justified content space around, right? And this division just has all of these links, and it probably has them in some sort of display column. And this division just has a bunch of writing and information in it, including some code examples. Okay, so that's great. Well, we can see that as I start compressing, my font size is adjusting. Oh, don't want that. Thank you. And then look at that. So at some point between my screen being, what's my screen size? Between my screen being 892 pixels to my screen turning into, it's 880 where they have that media query. Once it hits 880, we can see that there's some sort of media query that's telling that the display of my menu to disappear. So it's either turning it into display none, or they're using some sort of front-end framework that's saying, hey, if this condition is met, you're going to stop showing this and instead render a different element. And now I have this tab named information that drops down and shows me this. But this tab is not visible prior to, right? Before I had content and it's able to show me it. But as soon as that media query gets triggered, the tab of information changes from display none to display. And that division on the left-hand side named contents changes from display to display hidden. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yes, it does. I actually see that happen all the time, so appreciate it.
Of course. All right. Does anyone have any other questions regarding media queries or anything that was taught today? All right. If there are no other questions, in summary, today we covered CSS layout. We covered the different types of displays, such as display block, inline, and display inline block. We covered the different types of position relative, position absolute, position fixed. We covered z-index, float, overflow, and I don't believe we got to pseudo classes. And then we also covered responsive web design, meta tags, the responsive units of measurements, flexbox, and media queries. Does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that we taught today? All right, doesn't look like there are any questions. At this point, I am more than confident in everyone's ability to design their projects and make them into a responsive project. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.